Hello and welcome back to another video. I'm your host, Fenni of FrozenOver Studios, and today we're going to talk about something a little different. If you know me at all, you know I love cartoons, such as Adventure Time, Rick and Morty, Final Space, Has-Been Hotel, and the one we'll be addressing today, Steven Universe, which is officially ending with the finale of Steven Universe Future this Friday as of the time of this recording. I have been an avid watcher of this particular cartoon for years now, and in the most recent pair of episodes, Mr. Universe and Fragments, I've found myself pretty much awestruck at the direction the story has taken so far with the titular main character, Steven, and his development so far in the show. While I know most people are super hyper-focused on Steven's big shonen-style battle with Jasper and the dark direction that took, I'd like to focus more on Steven's fallout with Greg in Mr. Universe for a number of reasons. We all know that the struggles of growing up and becoming an adult differ from person to person. And I want to focus primarily on the episode Mr. Universe for this video because I feel like, as a parent, that it touches on some very unique viewpoints and issues that had not been addressed thus far within the show in much more than passing instances that could easily be missed. In this episode, Steven goes on a journey of self-discovery with his beloved dad, Greg Universe. And after watching this episode, a few things stood out to me. I don't know about you guys, but when I was a kid, much like Steven, I really looked up to my dad while I was growing up. And a surprising aspect of this particular episode to me is that it takes on the idea that there's this pivotal moment in a kid's development into an adult when they realize that their parental figure may not be as infallible as they might have thought while growing up. For example, when Greg breaks into his childhood home to steal back mementos of his own time of rebellion and discovery for himself, it really shows how appalled Steven is with his father's antics, but it also shows a heavy contrast between how Greg was raised and how he chose to raise Steven. Keeping in mind, Greg has been a really good parent in a lot of ways up to this point in the series. In no way do I see Greg as a bad father. However, in this episode, it calls into light his tendency to want to be more of a friend to Steven than an actual parent. While Greg has always been supportive and there for Steven when he needed guidance, there was a marked lack of structure and boundaries to Steven's upbringing. When Steven learned of Greg's strict parenting and the rules and guidelines he was expected to live up to, he couldn't comprehend why Greg seemed so unappreciative of what he had and even resented those boundaries and rules that were enforced on him. It occurs to me that Steven's reaction to Greg having hidden that wholesome, normal upbringing from him deprived Steven of the ability to choose for himself what he wanted for his own life, leading to a feeling of helplessness and a lack of control over his own well-being and future. I think this may be a contributing factor in why Steven is having such trouble controlling his powers. There was a notable lack of discipline in his formative years that may be manifesting themselves in these outbursts of temper, amplified by Steven's emerging diamond abilities. If Steven's powers manifest based on emotions and how he feels about himself at any given point in time, he may not have been able to develop the amount of control that he would need in order to keep his own temper and thus his powers in check as easily as he might have. Additionally, Greg depriving Steven of that kind of nurturing discipline in his life may have felt to Steven like being isolated into a gilded prison in his own way. Where Greg felt stifled and smothered by the strict rule of his parents over his life and longed for the freedom to find himself in his own way, so does Steven crave that grounding feeling of normalcy and feels like he missed out on so much he could have experienced, socializing with other kids his age, going to school, even missing out on normal everyday things like checkups with doctors and team sports, etc. This point is further hinted at in the episode Together Breakfast, where all Steven wanted to have was a family meal with the Gems and spend time together, but nobody seemed to understand why it was so important to him.
What's the matter, Steven? I wanted us all to have breakfast together. so I made together breakfast. But everyone keeps leaving.
Oh, that's not.
Another example would be when Greg was laid up with a broken leg in the episode House Guest, where Greg not only harms Steven's growing self-confidence by pretending his leg was still broken even after Steven healed it, but forced Steven into a parental role himself by his irresponsible and some might even say manipulative behavior.
Oh yeah. Oh, ouch.
Just stop, Dad. I get what's going on. Your leg's not broken at all, is it?
It was broken, but you healed it back at the car wash.
You lied to me! Now I can't do it anymore! You messed with my head!
Leaving Steven in a role of caretaker for his parental figure at a very young age, a behavior that not only hints at Greg's own immaturity on some levels, but also contributes in a marked way to Steven's own mental strain and trauma. Greg forcing his own viewpoints on Steven is by and large the exact same mistake Greg's parents made, trying to force him to be what they wanted him to be. Greg wants Steven to be a free spirit and find joy in the things Greg did when he was that age. But what Steven misses out on and longs for are the things that any child needs in order to develop proper coping mechanisms and habits in life, never giving him a chance to focus on what he might want for himself in the future or who he wants to be as a person, and therefore contributing to the lack of direction and purpose he's currently facing. Pointing out that he had gone halfway across the galaxy for his mom's side of the family, not knowing that he had family so close by, it must have felt like a massive betrayal to Steven, one that had been growing exponentially since discovering his Uncle Andy. Going back all the way to the episode Gem Harvest, Steven points out that he wants to get to know his human side and have a family and do human things. It's something that has always been a source of longing in Steven, because feeling like an outsider, not quite human, not quite a gem, Steven feels isolated and alone, unable to fit in either group because they don't understand both halves of him.
I love the gems, but I'm a human too. I never had a chance to know that part of my family, but now I do. Andy, I want to be your family.
In a sense, this sense of betrayal comes to a head in Mr. Universe, where it makes Steven blow up on Greg, pointing out that he's just like Steven's mom, always hiding things, never telling the truth, and running away from that responsibility, taking away the choices Steven should have been able to make for himself. Greg further fuels this feeling of betrayal by refusing to acknowledge that Steven is not okay, placating him with ice cream and overall not understanding or acknowledging what Steven's point was to begin with. Even when Steven speaks out about his feelings, they seem to go unheard, leaving Steven feeling more isolated and frustrated and alone than ever. So much so that he symbolically deletes Greg from his life, cutting him off just like the gems. His last port in the storm of his psyche having failed him, leaving him nowhere else to turn. It's important to understand that encouraging people who have been through the amount of trauma that Steven has been to speak out and open up is only effective if they actually feel like their words will be reaching the ones that they express them to. Empty placations can be seriously detrimental, especially in those kinds of vulnerable moments, and more so when coming from a person one actually respects and relies on for guidance. Yes, allowing one's child to have freedom, within reason, to discover who they are and support their interests and what they enjoy and aspire to be is very important, but so is structure, so is routine, and even the bland day-to-day behaviors of life. It's important not to take either side of the coin for granted, because both are important for developing a balanced and content individual mentality. Greg has been a wonderful guiding force for Steven through the entire show, full of wisdom and support, but he hasn't really been a parent to Steven, nor has he offered the stability that is key to a balanced home life. It's natural for Steven to feel upset by this, and the thought of all the things he missed out on, not because he wasn't capable of having them, but because Greg deliberately refused him the chance for them, leaving Steven understandably resentful. I think all of this can be symbolized in Greg's choice for the changed name that he took after leaving his parents. Taking it from a song may have seemed poetic and symbolic to Greg, but to Steven it feels like a mockery of the things Greg took for granted, and thusly denied Steven for his whole life. Greg got what he wanted out of life, but Steven never got the chance to make those choices for himself. I'm hopeful that this rift between Steven and Greg can be mended, but like all things, it takes time, and for that to happen, I personally feel like Greg would need to acknowledge that his parenting style has some major flaws to it, and has leaned too far toward the opposite extreme of his own parents' style of raising him. Yes, Steven is being a bit short-sighted and not seeing how Greg's upbringing made him so miserable at the time, but Steven is a kid. Greg, as the adult, could have handled that situation so much better than he did by not blowing off Steven's feelings and making him feel like his words were falling on deaf ears by offering empty platitudes. It's a heavy topic that I haven't seen handled in a lot of cartoons, except for maybe Adventure Time when handling the whole story between Finn and his father Marty, and it's not an easy thing to come back from once something like that puts a wall up between a parent and a child. Steven never got to really be a regular kid, and Mr. Universe needs to see that the world doesn't just revolve around him if he wants to be a genuine part of Steven's growth and development into a functional adult. How do you think Greg should have handled talking to Steven about the choices that he made as a parent? Do you think Steven overreacted? Leave a comment below and let me know your opinions. If you like this format of video, please leave a like and subscribe, click the bell for notifications, and check out my Patreon linked in the description. And until next time, this has been Fenni of FrozenOver Studios, signing off.